Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me. It's absolutely lovely to come here and see so many old friends and to be in such a lovely, relaxed attitude. I might just say a little bit about me. So I've got quite a variety of backgrounds. So my first degree was in psychology and maths. Then I did a little bit of philosophy. I've been very sorry I've never been able to study philosophy formally, as some people have here. Then I worked in industry for a while, and then I went into academia, and since then I've worked in computer science departments and information systems departments. But probably a common theme through nearly all the work I've done has been something to do with knowledge, because I've always been interested, since I was quite young, in how we can know things and what we can know. Because I think, how can you decide how you live your life unless you first work out what you can know, what it's possible to know? So even Ahmed's PhD and the work in Bangladesh ended up being about knowledge as well. So again, thank you. Now, why I started this particular talk is that the editors of the Journal of Information Technology asked me to write a response to an article that's been written by David Avison and Julian Mallarot. And some of you may know them. And they've written an article in JIT, which is, I think, going to be a bit controversial, because they're saying that lots of things in information systems aren't going well, and they blamed it on us having a theory fetish. So that our big journals were asking for too much theory. So they said that that was a bad thing and it was leading to all these other bad things. They didn't say no theory, but when you finished reading their article, you sort of got the impression that they really wanted us to have articles that didn't have any theory in them. And actually David and Julian actually suggested me as the respondent. I know them and I suppose they thought I'd be kind. So I've written that response. And in it I said that the problem wasn't with wanting theory in articles, and in fact to start calling for articles that don't have theory in them is a very dangerous thing in my opinion, because we need theory. Theories generalise knowledge. So if we don't have theory that helps us to predict things or do things in the world, we just keep repeating our mistakes all over again. We just have, what was the phrase that you used to use, Ahmed? Random rocks thrown into a pool, rather than building an edifice. Yes, rather than putting the rocks together in a pile. Yes, so then what I said in my response was that the problem wasn't really with the theory, it was actually our practices of theorising. And surprisingly, we still don't actually have a lot of guidance on how to build theory. So when you send journal articles in about a third to a half or even more, will get rejected because the editors and the reviewers will say there's not sufficient theoretical contribution. But then nobody tells us how to make a theoretical contribution. And we sort of have some confused ideas about how we theorise. And these are basically questions of epistemology. How do we actually develop knowledge? So here's just some ideas I have. So we'll just address this from the point of view, the problem of theorising. Is it to do with us, to me, and to you? So I'll give you these different viewpoints. So the first of all is us. Now this means us as a community of information systems people. So there's us, all being very solemn. Now, we heard this morning Michael talking about objective and subjective and different views on basically questions of ontology. And we all go into research methods classes and we get taught about positivism and interpretivism, and they get presented usually to us in a sort of a caricature type fashion. And often ideas get put together which I don't think belong together. It gets taught in a very simplistic way. And it's presented to us as being objective, isn't it? You get the book on research methods, it says, this is what interpretivists think. So, and there's some problems with this. And we have to think ourselves that how we think about the philosophy of science is in itself a social process. It's a social... The philosophy of science is subjected to trends and fashions and fads and its surrounding environment as much as anything else. Now, I'm going to give you a little personal view of what's happened in some of the philosophy of science. And the point isn't here whether you necessarily agree or disagree with how I'm showing these, but the point is to show that there's quite wild swings. There's different extreme views come about. And often these extreme views come because sometimes of what's happened in the world at the time. Sometimes it's because a person's gone before who's had some good ideas, but then has had some spectacularly bad idea as well. So everyone who comes after that person spends their time criticising them really harshly and then often goes too far in the other direction. So we end up with some sort of quite fluctuations. And it's this sort of thing, I think, that has affected our ability to understand and really truly work on the theorising process. Because we're stuck. A lot of information systems has got stuck in one of these swings. So this is my own view of the philosophy of science, just picking out some points. Now, if you actually go back and look at sort of when parts of science really got going in the 19th century, we actually had some fairly, what I would say were fairly sensible views. So this person, Whewell, he wrote a history of the inductive sciences, and he just showed that science pretty much proceeds by induction. We see a lot of things, not just counting things, but we see lots of occasions of, somebody drinking some contaminated water and dying, and we start assuming that contaminated water causes ill health. There's this person, Willem Dilthey, Introduction to the Human Sciences, and that's, I think, pretty much where interpretivism started, right back then. He actually contrasted the human sciences with the physical sciences and said quite sensibly that we need different techniques for studying mental events from studying these things like this. So this is really the difference. What's the difference about studying how people feel and think from studying physical objects?
You can do experiments quite nicely with physical stuff. You can cut it open.
Yes, that's one. If you want to, you can cut these things open. But what can you do with people that you can't do with these objects? You can talk to them, yeah. So you've got another way of getting data. So really the epistemology for the natural sciences probably should be different from the epistemology for the human sciences. You've got different ways of obtaining evidence. You can talk to people and see how they feel. Okay. And back here, if you read in the early 1900s, if you read a lot of the work about the splitting of the atom and so on, I think those scientists had quite sensible, reasonable views about what science was. They had fallibilist views. They didn't pretend that their science was that they were going to get truth. Einstein said once that it was as if we were observing some giant game of billiards played by someone else and we were just barely trying to understand the rules of the game. We could never know the whole thing. I mean, scientists know you can't know the whole thing. We don't know where the universe ends. We've got to live in a state of uncertainty. So I think back then, now this isn't what it's called. It's not called pre-positivism, but these were sensible views that existed a while back. I think I've left one out. Okay, there's something in my preparation of the slides. Up here there should be logical positivism, okay? So here in the 1920s, we did have one extreme movement called logical positivism, where people became extremely empirical and said you can't have statements that aren't either analytic or correspond to some thing in the world. And that position's not defensible because you can't start making statements, you know, I want to make a truth statement about this chair, and someone says to you, what does truth mean? And you've got no empirical correlate of truth. This is a very fine point, this one, but anyway, logical positivism was not a sensible position, was not defensible. And then we had Karl Popper, who actually did help scientists a lot. Now, what I meant by people being a product of their times was that Popper was living in an age where there were various unpleasant movements, the Nazis, and he thought communism as well. And he was very concerned that some of these ideological movements were trying to say that they were scientific. And so he was at great pains to try and point out what differentiated science from ideologies. So he became extremely rigid about trying to say that we should make falsifiable statements. And that's not a bad thing. That helped scientists. If you want to test your theories, you make your statements as strong as you can. But the other thing he was against was building knowledge from induction. So that makes life difficult because, as I said before, we do mostly build our knowledge from induction. Does everyone agree? Induction means you see lots of things happen. You know, you stick your hand in the fire 4 times and it gets burnt. You learn. It's called learning. Okay. Slow learning. Yeah. Okay. And you can understand why the first time, you can understand why your hand gets burnt. So it's not just counting things, that you understand the mechanisms. But that's pretty much how we build knowledge. It's sort of generally accepted. I said this is an idiosyncratic view, and it is. But so Popper, unfortunately, had that one idea which wasn't good. Then we had Kuhn. Now we have a reaction. We've had our very scientific people. Suddenly we get someone who portrays scientists, a certain type of scientists, sort of makes a caricature of them, and has this idea about paradigm shifts and incommensurability, that word. Anyway, but unfortunately I think Kuhn went too far as well. He had one good idea, yes, scientists, it is a social process, we do have shifts, but he sort of ended up with the idea that we couldn't really decide what was true or not, or we couldn't decide if something was more true than another thing. So this is the sort of person that climate change deniers like, because they can say, you know, my denial of science is just as good as your claim. My denial of climate change is just as good as your claim that it does happen. So, you know, this is too extreme as well. And then we had a whole period here, 1960s and 1970s, when I'm afraid sociologists got involved in what scientists do, and I don't think really listened to what scientists do, but had their own view of what scientists do, and they became very critical of the idea of science itself. And again, they were what you call relativists. They don't believe that you can have consensus on what's most likely the most close to being true. Interestingly, I just noticed the other day, one of these people from this period, Latour, who was strong relatives, sort of changed his mind, and it's partly because of climate change, and he's decided that it's really not a good idea to say that sort of anything goes, that anyone's view is just as good as anyone else's. So now I reckon we've got more reasonable views now. We find, if you read the philosophy of science, you'll find that people like this really have quite sensible discussions about inductive methods and how they can work. There are maybe what I would say are perhaps still not such terribly sensible views, such as socio-materialism, various we have some people in the information systems world who are very fond of Heidegger, which I think tends to lead us into problems as well. But if you look in the philosophy of science, if you go beyond information systems, we find quite sensible, reasoned discussions who take into account this history. Okay, now where are we in information systems? I'll just ask a little question here. If we were looking at mainstream North American journals, have they journeyed on down through this and out to the more sensible views, or where do you think they might be?
They haven't either got philosophy right, should I say anything else?
No. Well, no, well, not the North American journals, though. No. No, Ed's right. Because they somehow or other, it's if you look at the historical movements, you can almost trace the movements of individual philosophers. One who left Europe in the 30s, Feigl, I think his name was, and went to Minnesota. You can almost trace them taking so he sort of took away the views of almost of the logical positivists, took them to America, and then they just seemed to stay there, and they didn't sort of grow out of it again. So our journals are pretty much got this sort of view of the world, that you don't worry about induction, because induction actually as a logic is not, you can't sort of prove things through induction, but you can prove things through deduction, and so they want to stick to deduction. So this is what's normally called positivism in North American journals. So that means most of what you're doing is testing. You make hypotheses from somewhere. You're supposed to get a theory, take the hypotheses from the theory deductively, and then test it. Okay, so that's I'm afraid, I think, where the North American journals have got stuck. So they're still stuck there. They've got this emphasis on deductive reasoning. Now, the problem with deductive reasoning is that you can't actually generate any new knowledge from strictly deductive reasoning. Does everyone agree with me? Some of my colleagues in the accounting school don't agree with me. So a deductive statement strictly in logic is that all the people in this room have 2 legs. That's a theory. You are a person in this room, therefore you've got 2 legs. Have I learnt anything new? I knew at the start that everyone in this room had 2 legs. So you don't learn anything new. So then we get into all sorts of trouble, because in our journals we're supposed to make a theoretical contribution. So you're supposed to have some new knowledge. So what do? How do you get around this? You have a sort of sleight of hand. What people will do is they'll borrow some theory from somewhere else. Any theory. What's a theory?
Reason behaviour.
Theory of reason behaviour. Okay, so theory of reason behaviour holds in all the other areas in the world. We'll try and see if it works in information systems. And see, again, you're not really doing deduction, because you're assuming, you're saying all the people in this room have got 2 legs. I'm assuming all the people in the room out there have got 2 legs as well. So you sort of have sleights of hand. It doesn't properly work. It doesn't really work properly. And often this theory building's hidden. So people sort of extend models. They'll put in another, a modifying variable or something, and see. But then why did they pick that moderating variable? They can't do that deductively. So that these things are not actually sound reasoning. We end up with what a lot of people complain about is triviality. This is why industry is often not interested in what we do. We're spending all our time, because it's so hard to generate new knowledge by this means. The reason the paper get accepted is because of their extremely sophisticated statistical testing. Okay, so often they get accepted for method, not for actual contribution. So we do have some problems here, and there are worse problems than this. If you look at work that's done like this, you'll find people, it's actually bad academic practice at the end. If their results come out differently from what they accepted at the front, they go back and change the front. And you don't laugh, it is so, people don't, I've said this to a North American audience and they didn't understand what I was talking about. They said that's known as developmental reviewing. Or if some of your hypotheses weren't tested, you just take them out. So it leads actually to bad academic practice. It's against our rules of good conduct.
So on the basket of 8 journals coming to this category?
Yeah. Yeah, I forget. I don't know. We've done I'd say about 60% are hypothesis testing subjects. I mean, some of them are good, and later on I'll talk about what some good ones might be. But no, there are problems. Okay, so what do we do? Where do we go? Now, I don't have a picture of me in a rock band. Now, why is this? They've all been destroyed. No, the true story is I was never in a rock band. But that's me in Antarctica. Okay, so now so I'm just going to give you my view. So I've attempted to work through these problems and think where we should go, or at least where I should go, what makes sense to me. And now, the thing here is that with these things, when you choose an ontology is your view of reality, what things exist in the world, what categories of things exist, this truly is a subjective thing. You can't say to someone, you can't prove, someone who decides that everything in the world is in my head, you're all just constructions and figments of my imagination. You almost can't show them that that's wrong. You can, with some ontologies, show that they become inconsistent because the people will start using words that don't sort of belong in their ontological view. And another thing you can show is that often people with their views of the world, with these things, they'll argue for one thing, but when you look at how they live their lives, they will live a different way. And so I think that's bad too. I think that's like bad faith. So if you're going to say you've got a particular philosophical position, it should be one that you apply in your life. So, okay, there are several people here in this room, at least 4 of us, who sometimes go to Fellows Garden at ANU, and we're known as the P&W Club, and that stands for Popper's World, because we are disciples of Popper, aren't we? Yes. Yes. So Popper has a very sensible ontology, and it belongs to Habermas as well. And an ontology is just a way of talking about what the world is and putting things in categories that seem to belong to each other and have something in common, so that you can talk about them in a sensible way. So to Popper, there's world 1, which is the world of physical objects. So these are things other people call brute facts. There's some things in the world that we don't act as if they're subjective. We don't think that we can walk through walls. We know that the wall, we will all agree that the wall's there. That's an objective, a brute fact. Mostly we can agree on that sort of thing. There's another world of what goes on inside each person's head. So that's the mental world. That's not observable to anyone else unless I tell you what's in my head. And then there's a third world, which is the world of abstract objects. Now, this is what this morning Michael was calling subjective objective or objective subjective. Intersubjective. Okay. So these are these things that people have invented, mathematics, language, and it's hard to get by in life without recognising these things exist. You have trouble. If you want to be just a world 1, I almost think the socio-material people are going back to this and leaving out this one. but it's hard. We can't talk about anything unless we have these words, because if we've got to have some notion like true or false or fair, all these things belong in here, and they are socially constructed or individually constructed even, and they help us make sense of the world. And it's interesting to keep these things in these categories, because you can do and study these things in different ways. So these things here, Craig McDonald, who's here, is actually a far greater expert than me on this world, and has even made some advances, I believe, in how we think about this world, which we might discuss later. Or that's true, isn't it?
I might have a little bit of word about that tomorrow if I may.
All right. Okay, but see, here we can say even whether these things are, say, for consistent. Like if you make one mathematical statement, you can say whether it's consistent with another statement. Well, you can't do that with these sorts of, you can't do it with them. Now, these things are connected, so you need people in here to sense what's in there, and you need people in here to create these things. It's a bit hard for these things here to influence world one directly, but that's, I think Craig's got a little twist on that, but I'll leave that for the moment. Okay, so this to me seems like a good, sensible ontology to use, and that it's got good people who put it forward. Habermas, good thinker, Popper, and this, if you just start out with this, then you don't have to worry about all these things about various realisms. So anyway, and then as far as epistemology goes, I think myself that most of us live our lives, we reason in different ways. Sometimes we reason deductively, sometimes we reason inductively, sometimes we make guesses, which is abduction. All of those are perfectly good ways, forms of reasoning in theorising. So we shouldn't have just one way. We should allow them all to be used. And another author I like is Stephen Toulmin, who says that really what we're doing in a lot of this is making a good argument. And you put forward a good argument, and the argument has to have some evidence underneath as to why it's a good argument. And he is was a logician, but people said he was a professor of ill logic, because he said, which is again I think quite true, that in everyday life we don't normally use formal logic. We have other ways of reasoning, and he said that there were, across nearly all our fields, there were some ways of reasoning that were common, that belonged to all the fields, and there are things usually like we recognise that you can't in the course of an argument say A is equal to B and then say A is not equal to B. That's a poor argument. Does everyone agree with that? I've had a little experience to the contrary of this. At one point in my life, I was advising a women's group on research methods, and they asked me to be involved in their research because I could do statistics. And then I had to have a talking to, because I was using words they didn't like. I might have been using words like test or validity. And so I said to them what I've just said to you, but you can't have arguments where you say A equals B and then A is not equal to B. And they said I was locked in the male-dominated Aristotelian view of the world. And they weren't quite sure I could belong to the feminist group. Now, I shouldn't laugh because it was a fruitful discussion. I went away, they gave me books on feminist reasoning, and I gave them books on Toulmin, and we both learned from the encounter. So we shouldn't really laugh. Do you want to say something, John?
I'm just wondering, is information systems area having a crisis or something? Why?
Right.
Are you wondering where you're coming from or going to?
Because
or where you fit in academia or something?
it was back to do with this journal practice. Those things that David Avison and that were saying, they're quite true. You can't get lots of things published. Walter does grounded theory methods, he does theory building, if you try and submit to North American journals and you're not doing theory testing, you're in trouble.
Well, then set up another journal and people have to play by your rules.
I guess we'll go and tell the promotion committee. Anyway, I'll keep going. Okay. But this is a good point that Tom's making here. Okay, so anyway, this has given me the opportunity to work on what I will write, which will be a paper on theorising and how it should be done, or could be done, when information systems still is using those outdated views. Now, where's your place in theorising? I've only got one more slide. So now, this is the story. What does this mean to you? Okay, so we've got a mixture of people here who various levels of publishing. So who has perhaps had an experience where they've sent in a paper and the editors have said there's not sufficient contribution to knowledge? All of us. Okay. So basically what they're saying is that you're not doing your theorising properly. And Walter and I had one paper which is still unpublished, isn't it, Walter? We sent it to MISQ, and we had a really wonderful statistical method of inductively extracting relationships. Amazing statisticians working on the paper. The reviewers said, this method has never been used in information systems before. And then also, one of them quoted the rules of MISQ at the time, which said, research articles cannot develop theory unless they also test it in the article. And because of the argument we had with them, they changed the rules. But the paper still has never been published, unfortunately. We spent so much time trying to counter these other views, it became sort of unwieldy and we gave up. So this is what I'm just thinking, is it's good to think of theorising as a social process and to think of your article where it fits in the whole pattern. So where does it fit in the wall? Firstly, you should get your own epistemology and ontology straight, because that sort of comes through often. But here, so this wonderful diagram. So we have to think always here of the problem that we're addressing. Very rarely will articles get accepted if you don't actually identify the problem. That you're best if you, in my view, and other editors say this too, you're much better off to start with a problem focus. You don't start off with, there is a gap in theory. You start off with, there's a real problem. Major companies are still not understanding properly how they get value from knowledge management systems. So that's a real problem, and the answer is interesting to someone. So we have to show that the answer is interesting. That's really where you should be starting from. Good papers, if they're really interesting and fairly new sort of things you're looking into, often the journals might overcome a little bit of a deficiency in methods and so on. But then you've got to think where you are. Now, this is the problem with the Avison and Mallaront paper. If you have papers that don't have theory in them at all, you don't have to position yourself against the existing knowledge base. So the main problem you've got to make is, I have made a new contribution to theory. I've increased theory, I've improved theory. So what have you got to be able to justify in order to show that you've made an improvement? What have you got to be able to show? The gap. You've got to show what was there before. So in order to demonstrate that I've made an advance of some sort, now I think various thinkers in Walter's grounded theory work, sometimes there's differing opinions on how much of it you need first. But if you don't do that first, you risk the chance of doing your work and then finding out that you've done something that somebody already knew. So this is a thing that authors don't do terribly well often. So good ones, there is a paper I've written on this. I haven't got it here. Anyway, there's a paper that's going to appear in JAIS about this sort of thing. But you find good authors. So this is the Ben-Basat type model. You do some sort of theory testing model. You typically do an experiment. You do a very thorough review before you start of what other people have done. You often present a paper with prior empirical findings, and then, yes, you show where the gaps are. But see, here I put in too, wisdom from the field, empirical evidence. If you're going to do this well, some people say you should only look for your literature review in other good journals, but I don't think that's good. If there's work out there going on in the...
Yeah, it's important. I reviewed a paper recently where someone thought that there was a big hole in the electronic government that they perhaps had on all the work that's been done in information systems that have that whole work done.
That's right, yeah. So anyway, so you do need to look at the prior knowledge base, and that means you can't have atheoretical arguments. That's why I think David Avison and Julian Malleron are actually wrong in what they were doing. So that can provide the grounding for what you're doing, and then you can decide what you're doing. Are you doing... I don't think we should all be expected to develop some huge theory in every paper. And David and Julian were right about that. If you can just add a small bit, so in some papers, you just realise, place your paper against the state of knowledge in the world, and if you're testing, if you have added another variable to a model, we are doing it in a slightly different context, that's good, as long as you do it thoroughly. Our journals should be more accepting of theory building papers. Now, Walter's grounded theory method is just one way of theory building. They do tend to accept that way, but there are other ways. And another thing you could, which is very useful, is when lots of people have done lots of smaller studies of individual phenomena, someone comes along and tries to bring them all together in a theory and review paper and do proper theorising. And then the cycle goes round. Now, there's a very good book called Great Minds in Management, which has got a history of how, personal accounts of how quite a number of management people actually developed their really good theories, like the guy with Bandura with self-efficacy theory, Porter. A lot of them, those theories developed. This model actually follows what they've done. You'll find there's lots of, they probably came up with it's a creative process as well, of course. So some of them just had an insight at the start, and that would have been a theory building article. They had some insight, they gathered some evidence. Most of them said they had trouble getting their first papers published. These papers can be, the first ones can be hard. And then over years, other people did studies and they went round and round and they inductively built up their strong theory. So I've come to the end then. How are we for time?
Content, or is there further something?
No.
Okay, so thank you, Shirley. Are there questions that we wish to ask the Professor? Statements, observations?
So basically, like in the morning discussion, as I mentioned, the engineering perspective, why information systems doesn't accept the engineering perspective? Like the practice has like we want to create an hypothetical world, but in engineering philosophy it's not that. Like we value practice, we accept practice, and from practice deduct the things and construct.
Yep.
Because today this building is remaining like this.
Yep.
There's no theory before. So after solving the problem, they develop the theory.
Well, that actually happens in design science in our discipline. It's what's called design science. It is an engineering model. It's about building things. It's what's in computer science.
I went through the whole process of the design science, what they are trying to explain. Again, they are missing. Because they're borrowing the terms of engineering design, or they call it design science. So I happened to see one professor, so he was saying in design science research or design research. And so again, they're trying to compartmentalize into design science itself 2-3 subdomains and getting confused. So the engineering philosophy is actually something that's intertwined. The analysis or design or yin and yang. The analysis of the problem, once is designed, if the design is explained that.
Yes, okay. There's several ways.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest one of the difficulties I think there is that engineering is a convergent view. Engineering is usually attempting to solve a problem, not all problems. And as you say, you might be able to deduct some theoretical thing that will assist other future engineering activities. But it's very much, in my view, it's an applying ideas to solve a convergent problem. Whereas theory building is actually attempting to build an answer to divergent problems, trying to establish a basis in which one can address novel questions meaningfully. So to allow the engineering to take place.
I think they're very similar myself. That the thing in sort of engineering, the connection between their knowledge base. So in here you could actually say building artefacts as well, and that should be a test of these things. So if you've got theory of mathematics, when you build your bridges, you use that maths, and then you're, in a way, you're testing it. You're testing the theory. But I said this morning, there are cases here, if by analysis you mean behavioural science and experiments, there are people like Ron Webber who do experiments, who do analysis work of how people behave, and they do it in such a way that it can feed back into building. So Isaac's work is too, actually, because they do experiments, they actually isolate cause and effect. So they can work out, they do an experiment to say, does using a modelling grammar with an optional property increase modelling success? And then they conclude, yes, it does. So then people who are going to design modelling grammars include optional properties. So that's an engineering. So they go from the analysis, from observation to building. But I don't think we do it enough.
And just what I'm trying to say is that analogy I'm taking has to be taken. So what I'm saying is highest theoreticians are not really valuing the practitioner's experience.
Well, I think we should, wisdom from the field.
Let's say in the practice, suppose a practitioner wants to express his experience in building a system or running a program or a project. He wants to, say, publish in an academic journal. The minute you are questioning, oh, did you review the prior, for example, prior literature? And the prior literature has no meaning, because it's a virtual world they created project program or the information system development. But this one, the practitioner is real, is the
Look, I'd have to, this is a very long conversation, I'm afraid, but so I do some work with people in Germany, and a lot of them build things that are really practitioner type things, and then we have to spend time reflecting on it to see what they've actually learned that's new. Because often in those long stories, if you give someone a case study, it might be helpful to someone else whose case is almost exactly the same, but to most people it won't be. So what you've got to try and draw out of your case is the general principles that you think would apply somewhere else, like the really clever new thing that you learned in your case. And if you can do that, it probably would get published. So it's a very difficult thing. Okay, any more questions?
I'll just take that a little bit further, because in other disciplines, in the creative arts, for example, they conduct research as well, but they produce an artefact, which is an artwork or a statue or a dance. But that isn't the research. The research is the exegesis that goes with the artefact. So the exegesis writes up what the social setting is that this artefact has come from and is going into, and it's that is the knowledge, not the artefact per se. It's not the art, it's the exegesis that is the research component of that activity.
I suppose I'd ask,
what's the problem you're trying to solve? I come from a computer science background. When I started studying education, I had to come to terms with the fact that people in education are from the social sciences area and they have a different worldview. And what they say as research to me is just nonsense, and vice versa. I mean, different disciplines have different approaches to the world and sub-disciplines.
Well, this one for us, which is this is the behavioural science, social science approach I'm talking about. I don't think we've got it organised very well. We can do better. We're still stuck in this deductive testing mode. About 70% of articles in our major journals are theory testing.
So you're proposing to try and change the minds of the people who have made their career in that area,
yes,
and
yes,
change their status and
yes,
position.
Yes.
And don't you just need to build up a new hierarchy?
Well, I sort of think we've changed it a little bit with design science, and Walter's working away getting grounded theory more acceptable. So it's not, I think we are further along than management. If I read the management journals, I think they're still, we've got a little bit of an asset because we do build things that have got a more tangible existence than them. You know, yeah, so it's a bit different for us from management, but no, so I think we can do better. Anyway, Tom, we have to try.
Well, Niels Bohr said that a new paradigm will only take over when the components of the old paradigm die. And that's true to a certain extent, but obviously there's got to be somebody in place to replace the ones that just die, so you've got to take a generational view sometimes of these things as they develop. So we've got to corrupt young as soon as possible.
So we don't want people to keep reading research methods books that say the three paradigms in the world are interpretivist, positive and critical thinking, and never think more deeply about what goes on underneath.
Well, that's why we with my students, I like showing them the Nicholas article, the lady from Tallinn, who showed there are actually 30 different sort of research methods, ranging all the way, depending on various dimensions you want to have, all of whom have a contribution to make to human knowledge in all sorts of different ways. But I was raised as a behavioural scientist in the hypothetico-inductive, deductive logical cycle, which is meant to be a mix between induction and deduction. And then when I moved into information systems, the inductive bit sort of got missed out. And you see bizarre things, apart from rejection from North American articles, but trying to find an examiner. So I remember once one of my students' theses, the examiner working in the area of complex adaptive systems said, "Oh, I can't examine this work. I see no hypotheses." How do you do a positivist approach into a complex adaptive system? Well, an interesting question, especially when she was trying to show the different philosophical models and they have an impact upon systems design. So yeah, there are some difficulties in these new approaches, etc.
They're not new approaches, they're old approaches.
Well, but we still have defined in the positive thing between the Fisherian and Pearson approaches towards hypothesis testing. You still have the Bayesians now popping up against the statisticians and frequentists and all the rest of it. So, yeah.
Yes, I just wondered, Shirley, what do you think about pragmatism?
Oh, I think it's quite sensible myself. It's probably got, you know, I think this is sympathetic in general. An interesting thing is if you look at these philosophers themselves, hardly any of them ever did anything in the world. No, they sat about and thought, but Peirce, he did, he was a surveyor. He behaved so badly, I think they threw him out of the university and he had to go away and earn his living. And so he had to live a practical life. I mean, a lot of these things, the people who hold some of these views, they can't live life like that. If you say you're an interpretivist and you don't believe in science, and then you go along to the doctor and say, I want this pill that's been through a clinical trial, please, you're showing bad faith. You're not carrying out your views into the world.
Very well, I think we should draw to a close. Please join me in thanking Professor Gregor for